Recording. Okay, so culturally humble communications. What's something you've learned? And hopefully, we shared some last week, so I'm sure you have some other ideas to add on to that.
Well, for me, Jennifer, yes, our target focus is our indigenous, communities, for this particular work group and the primary work that we do for our state agencies. But graciousness and respect and a sense of I'm talking just to you. I can't remember who was our communications keynote. I can never remember her name, where she taught us that in our messages, even though they might go to a big group, that we should try to word that message so it sounds like I'm just talking to Jennifer and I'm just talking to Michelle or just to Tom, even though you're all included.
Oh, yes. I know what you're talking about now. Anne Handley.
Thank you. And to
Mhm.
me, that's important, not just for our indigenous communities, but to everyone that we're communicating with, because we all want to feel acknowledged.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Annette. How else do we think about culturally humble communications, or what's a strategy that works?
Well, I'd like to follow on with what Annette said. Sometimes when people ask me about approaches to evaluation, I like to tell this joke that I think it's an equal mix between empathy and interrogation, just because those
Mm,
two words together seem so misplaced.
yeah.
But I think empathy, regardless of who the race or the group of people that I'm talking to, is really important,
Mhm.
especially in Alaska because people are stretched so thin. They're not looking for somebody to come in and criticize them, but to have some understanding and some acknowledgement of, what they're doing. And then they're more open to hearing about ways for improvement or considering ways for improvement. No one likes to be uh, observed, you know,
Mhm,
but
mhm.
to share some empathy and to understand that person's perspective, I think is pretty important.
Yes, thank you.
David, this is Becky. I'm going to build off of yours. Um, Finding that safe environment where you can meet people where they feel safe and comfortable. And we have found by actually being present, and that's similar to what you said, but being there, making that effort to be there is what really makes the difference, and valuing them and acknowledging them. And in Minnesota, we're working on our survey responses for our annual performance report, and our deadline is coming up this Friday.
Mm,
And so, really checking in with the schools and letting them know that each voice matters that we're receiving. And that we see that though your school may have got 8 family voices there, those 8 voices represent and are valuable to us.
that's right. Good. That's great. I love the idea that sometimes geographic location even matters for humble communications.
I
Other
will
thoughts?
piggyback a little off of Becky too. And
Mhm.
this is in the context of a teacher, but I think you could apply it to students as well. So in Minot, Michelle will know all about this. In Minot, North Dakota, when I was teaching there, they did a big survey that I think that they came up with themselves. I don't think it was a Google survey, but it was some kind of survey that they did, all the district employees, and they sent it out to all of us and we responded back. And they didn't like it. They didn't like our responses. And so they spent district money to the tune of like $50,000 to bring in an external analyst
No.
to evaluate our responses rather than just taking them at face value. And in addition to that, I think as teachers, I'm assuming all of us at some point have been in a classroom. Um, as teachers, how many times did the administration ask for your opinion on something, survey you, poll you and see what you wanted, and then ignore every single thing that you said? So I think that important in communication is the follow-up. Like, humble communication is not only, because we can't say the perfect words every time for every person. Like Annette was saying, like, if we
Right.
are trying to talk to someone in our initial communication as if they're an individual, that's going to be really difficult to do with all of the different styles and approaches and backgrounds. Okay, but so we have to kind of broaden there. That's important in the first place. But the follow-up afterwards is just as important as the initial communication. If you're asking for people's opinions and you say that you want all the voices at the table, and you even get all the voices, and then
Mhm.
ignore them later on, then you are not part of this humble communication cycle. And that applies not just culturally, but also for leaders and employees, or adults and kids as well. You listen to their voices and then do something about it. Not that we want the inmates to run the asylum. We don't want that either. And sometimes people will respond without understanding, everything
Mhm.
about the situation. Anyway, we just have to be
Yeah.
careful in our follow-up later on that we actually do something when people are sending us big messages. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. I just said that yesterday in a meeting with a project. They are creating a family engagement measure. And that's exactly what I said. I say you have to have a plan for sharing it back with them. That is critical. So I'm really glad you brought that up. I added from CSEP the empathy interview process template that they put together. Karen Ward had spoken to us years ago about this. Not the NOG, but I think I can't remember which group, if it was the director's webinar, but as a tool for getting perspectives, and of course working with it and letting them know how you used it. Great. Anyone who didn't get a chance to share?
I was just gonna say, in addition to like what Jenny had said, I mean, is that, and I just believe like we're trying so hard to build trust, right? In those communities, between the communities and us, that not only honoring their voice and the follow through, but comes that I'm gonna do what I say. Like, you can't build
Mm.
trust if you're not gonna back up that you're really going to deliver those things you say you will. And being cautious of what we're saying then too, that we can, so we can deliver.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and
Jennifer, this is Becky. I was just going to add something to that. I think it's so true. Yesterday I had a meeting with the superintendent where my kid goes to school, and like he was saying kind things, but the actions weren't coming through in his body language. And so there's this mixed message. And as a parent, it just felt really icky afterwards. And I was talking to my husband about that. Like, when people are showing the empathy, it's those words and actions need to align.
yeah, yeah, words and actions aligning. That's great. Yeah, I was listening. This is related, but not exactly the cultural humble part of the communications. Do you all know the podcast Hidden Brain? Sean Kirby-Dothan. We get it on the radio here, and so I was aware of it just because it would come up on NPR, but it's a podcast as well. And it's writ large psychology kind of thing. So various topics that would probably fall under that. And he had a professor from the Harvard Business School talking about communication. And I would highly recommend both of the sessions. I had read Super Communicators, and it has a lot of the same ideas as that, but it's presented a little differently, has different stories, and it's good to be reminded. It was really helpful in terms, especially the second episode was about having challenging conversations, which are certainly, they're going to be necessary in any work, but from what I understand from my projects who work with Native communities, you're more often going to have hard conversations because of the history between the two groups, right? Who you represent as the state and who they are representing in their work. And so I would recommend was talk. I'll put it in the chat. And it looks like there's already an audio book of it, which the science of communication and the art of something. Let me look. Super Communicators is really good too, and a really like nice, easy to listen to audiobook. And I actually give, did I tell you guys this last time? I give a talk on communication for my church for people getting married. And I'm the worst. I'm really not a good communicator, which is why it's fascinating to me because I'm always trying to get better. But you just start noticing there's so much out there to learn from and to continue to grow in. So it's talk, the science of communication and the art of being ourselves. So Allison Wood Brooks, 1L. Okay. So just in case you're interested, and also she's been on a bunch of podcasts, so you can get the information for free on podcasts. But thank you for going back to that conversation from last week and thinking some more about communication. I really do think like you're never there with communication. You're always there's always still something to figure out. So you all shared graciousness, empathy, safe environment, follow-up, trust, and alignment between words and actions. All right. So my next question is, what did you learn about exploratory data analysis and how might it help with your SPDIG work, if at all? I have no idea. I think it's a really interesting idea. I'm not exactly sure how it would look in your work, but I would love to hear about it.
I'll just get this up. I met Matthew in 2022 at the National ESEA, and I literally typed him a note that said something to the effect of, everything you talked about was like the biggest aha moment in data collection for my project, because I had been struggling with that quantitative versus qualitative. And then, there's this school of thought that if you're not only crunching numbers and putting numbers, that you're hocus pocus in your data collection. And I'm like, but I'm working with real people, with real kids, real families. And how do you capture that? And I loved what Matthew was teaching us and still does, is that you absolutely have to check your bias at the door. And so for me, that was the aha moment, that he gave very useful tips and strategies on how to check your bias at the door. And just a side note, my bias is so well known on another Matthew that John sent me back a note when I told you guys, oh, I love Matthew Courtney, yay. John sent me back a note and said, why is Annette talking about McConaughey again?
Oh.
So I still like McConaughey, but
different.
Yeah, but yeah, so, and I've trained I don't know, a year or so ago, I trained some of my teachers on Matthew Courtney's data method, and they also had that same aha. Instead of saying, oh, these families are lazy, these kids are lazy, that kiddo never does their homework, and yada yada yada, by graciously saying, you have to leave your bias at the door. You don't have to fess your bias up. It's none of our business if you have a bias, but put it in your head and then set it aside. And I loved where Matthew's example, where he's like, okay, so if we just look at the raw data, it says our colored youth, they score in the gutter. But when he walked you through that spreadsheet and he put it side by side and he made it real and not just this big, huge lump, they were only like 2 or 3 percentiles behind, or they
Mm.
were ahead. So yeah, I'm a huge fan. So thanks for bringing him to us.
No, again, right? Yeah.
Mm.
Others' thoughts about exploratory data analysis in the SPIDIG?
I think I only know enough to know that I need to know more. So from what I
Yeah.
gleaned from the material, it's like there's probably a lot more to this. The two concepts that stuck out to me were one is the focus on discovery versus the regimented sort of research model. And in the continuous improvement world, there's a lot of thought around discovery as well. In a continuous improvement world, you have the same thing usually, a very structured system, a PDSA cycle of some type, maybe DMAIC, DMAIC, versus in the private sector, they know that you have to discover opportunity or you're sitting still and you're just going to go out of business. And I don't think that we are immune from that in educational endeavors either. We have to have systems and methods for discovery. And then even from the continuous improvement gurus, we can learn, you even have to organize yourselves differently internally to have a group of people function as a team and look for discovery opportunities. The second thing I liked about it was the discussion of anomalies. And again, in the continuous improvement world, one of the little gems in there, if you get into it, is that anomalies are important and they're worth paying attention to. And now with AI, you can take data sets and do a job like never before to flag anomalies and get into them. And there's a relationship between anomalies and opportunity because so often, everything reflects circumstances in a place and time. These anomalies can reveal possibility. So back to discovery, internal organization for discovery and quantitative and qualitative methods for discovery. Anomalies can be key to that. And it's low-hanging fruit because it's right there. It's in your data set, but you just don't know to look for it. And I would say back to AI, I don't know if we've ever had tools like now to take a large data set and choose your criteria for what you think an anomaly looks like, or pose the question to AI and then just have it cull through all this stuff and say, hey, here's the top 10 not predicted things, not predicted pieces of data here. And then I always love ChatGPT. Do you want to know more? Yes, tell me more. Let's get into it. Tell me about each of those. Start with number one. So those are a couple of impressions I had in taking a look at it. Like I said, I feel personally, there's probably a lot more to learn on the methodical. Maybe I'm overthinking methodical side of it, but definitely it's something that's intriguing and hooks up to some things in other parts of quantitative data analysis.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom.
Jennifer, one of the things in Minnesota that we've been working on is when we've been getting the qualitative data and we put it into themes, is actually going back then and finding direct quotes that align to those themes. And so when we share out the information with our schools, they can see their voice being present in this cumulative qualitative research.
Great. Love that. Yeah, I love quotes. One study I was reminded of that Annette had brought to our attention a few years back that I think would be related to exploratory data analysis. Tell me if I'm wrong on that. Was this hidden strengths. And so it was looking through the NAEP math and finding areas where American Indian Alaska Native students did better than the typical, and then your average student, they as a group did. And as I recall, geometry was one of the areas. So, you know, what a great thing. And geometry is so related to jobs later on, like there's a lot of like opportunity for thinking about the continuum of education, that doing something exploratory, like looking at NAEP data for those unpredicted results, as Tom was saying.
And Jennifer, of course, when, I saw you wanted us to dive into Courtney's work, I was like, oh, the NAEP, the Montana research, for the Montana, for the NAEP
Mhm.
results. And I think I don't think I need to stop using that word. I
Mhm.
know that that's what Matthew's trying to get us to realize, is that
Mhm.
we weren't necessarily trained incorrectly in data analysis, but what happens in the way that our college courses are training us in data analysis is that it's not training us to look beyond the numbers on the paper and
Mhm.
realize that those numbers represent something real.
Right.
Somebody real. And so if we looked at that NAEP, we would just automatically say, the way I was taught in college and grad school, we would automatically say, oh, Montana's Indigenous youth kind of are stinky in their math skills. And because of the way I was trained, I wouldn't take my brain down a path to say, hold on a second. There has to be some hope. There has to be something. Clearly, every
Right.
single one of these children cannot be a complete failure across all
Right.
mathematical concepts. And I think we owe it to our students. We owe it to our teachers in particular. Instead of saying, teachers, look at you, you're not teaching math. Oh, teachers, look at you, you're rocking it here. These
Mhm.
kids are shining.
Right.
And so my recommendation is, I always start the school year out. I always reattach this research study and I say, remember, please try to start your school year out with your kiddos. Give 2.5, 3 weeks on the math concepts that they rock. Let them get their math brain back after summer break
Yeah.
with confidence, then roll into the new stuff or the frustrating stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And when you look at the description, it doesn't say exploratory data analysis, but it kind of does, right? The way that sorry, it's not Matthew in this case, the way that the researchers describe it. So yeah, I'm glad you brought both things to our attention, Annette. Yeah, and how hopeful that study is compared to everything else you've probably heard about American Indian and Alaska Native students for the last however many years, right? So yeah, it's just good to be reminded. We talk all the time in special education about strengths based, but the reality that I see on the ground is almost never is that what's really happening. And not to say that I'm doing any better than anyone else, but all right. So thank you for taking the time to learn about exploratory data analysis. Thank you for taking the time to share thoughts about it. Yeah, I think it's promising, right? Okay, so culturally humble evaluation. Before I get started on some of the things I found that I thought might be interesting to you, what would culturally humble, or what does culturally humble evaluation mean to you? And how does it look in your SPDIG work? I can put the question in the chat for everyone.
Jennifer, for us, we're always seeking, oh, go ahead, Annette.
No, go ahead, Becky.
We're always seeking to learn and grow. And one of the things with continuous improvement is at the end of each of these cycles. So once we collect the data and we share out the summary report, we always go back and we ask, okay, what can we do differently next time this is done? What questions should we have asked? We asked the SPDG coordinators, what were we missing? And then, while it's fresh in our mind, we may have made note of that. So next year, when we come around to that survey, we already have that starting point.
Awesome. Yep, you all are really good about that.
For me, culturally humble evaluation. So particularly when I'm talking to our tribal consultation partners across Montana, I'll start out with thank you for your invaluable service to the Montana SEP, you know, without you, blah, 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 or with you, we've been able to yada, 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 and point out, you know, 1 to 3 things that through their guidance and wisdom, we've been able to achieve. And then I'll pinpoint our data supports these statements. So I'm letting them know, hey, we did some really good things through your guidance. Our data is still showing us that we have, you know, a weakness because they don't want me to sugarcoat and pretend like everything is roses. They want the
Right.
truth from our data. I'm looking, you know, as you're reading this, do you have some immediate thoughts on how we might take some immediate actions? I'm looking forward to our continued partnership so that we can address these issues on behalf of the children we serve. And, you know, so finding, you know, like they did in that research, I'm not just going to I give them the data, but I don't just leave the data with the ugly percentiles,
Right.
because there was always something good that came out of it that the numbers themselves are not going to
Right.
pinpoint, because the numbers
Right.
don't talk to the teachers, the numbers don't talk to the students.
Yeah, and if you kind of have a template, from what I heard you saying, you kind of have a template in your head of how you're going to present it. And part of the template is this is what's going right. You know, there's gratitude, appreciation. This is what's going right. And then, you know, we need your help in this area.
Exactly. Yes. You know, so, you know, back to, you know, 1,000 years ago when I was in high school, you know, training to be a secretary, you know, the complaint letters. I mean, so it's basically, you know,
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
stolen that from decades ago. The complaint letter format is that when you have a complaint with a business, you tell them what they did right, then you voice your complaint, then you come back to, you know, I still appreciate you and how can we help resolve this issue? Um, because if somebody hears that something is good,
Hmm.
they're willing to listen to we still have a problem.
Hmm. Hmm. Yep. And showing the data makes data more friendly, right? Like, 'cause these are good data. These are happy data. Good.
Yeah, and for a lot of when I follow up and I do personal phone conversations with our tribal consultation partners, a lot of them will say, I really appreciate this conversation, Annette, because I really didn't realize what I was actually doing.
Yeah.
Because we've invited them to the table, but we're so entrenched in our education world. They're gladly coming to the table, they're gladly having conversations with us, but they didn't fully understand the impact that they were having. Because,
Yeah.
you know, they don't talk education, you know. They don't talk these data sets. You know, they don't talk, you know, curriculum and teaching
Yeah.
and learning and all of that good stuff. It's not their forte.
Right.
So it's been, and so with that also is taking the time, not just, you know, written communications, but hey, this is Annette. do you have time? I'd like to talk to you about your valuable membership in our tribal consultation partnership, to actually physically have a phone conversation, because they're scattered. Some of them winter, some of them are living in Arizona, and so I can't exactly drive to their home and have a conversation. But I can do a phone call. And so it's that mix of, I value you enough that I'm going to reach out in multiple avenues.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to share the things I found that I thought you all might be interested in. And I mean, you're probably not going to tell me if you're not interested, but certainly I want to hear if there's something you want to delve into a little more deeply. All right. So completing the installation conversation. Are we ever really done? Probably not. But I think it might be my favorite stage, implementation stage. Exploration gets a lot of notice because everyone loves the hexagon tool. But I love implementation stage. All right. So resource of the month. What was the resource of the month? Am I going too far back? Oh, I went back to the communication. Sorry about that. Okay, there we are. So in an interview with Rodriguez Lombert, an elder said, "Sovereignty as tribal nations was given to us by the Creator. It is sacred. Data to exercise our sovereignty is also sacred." So I think this really speaks to what Annette was just sharing. Give people their data, and certainly in Minnesota, you all have had conversations about this. How can tribal indigenous culture knowledge, such as creation stories, be used? And so this is a little bit different. So this is from the same study, but a little bit different than having access to data. Taking what's already there, the cultural aspects that are really important, that are shared, is there a way to use that culture, to build on that culture in your evaluation plan? If you noticed in the strengths report I just shared with you, the strengths research, it talked about the cultural values of respect, et cetera, and that's how they created their study, was around that conceptual framework. And so could creation stories be part of your evaluation plan, or part of the conceptual framework it's based on, or something else? Just an idea.
I don't know so much about cultural knowledge in terms of creation stories, but often in some of the projects I've been involved with various school districts in Alaska, we focus on traditional ecological knowledge, or tech.
Okay.
And some of this is around climate change and ocean science. And Western approaches to science are a little different than Alaska Native approaches to understanding the environment, but they both have some overlap in long-term observations and change over time, and understanding what relationships are between various actors in the environment. So, we try to build on that. And, what does this mean traditionally for Alaska Native cultures and coastal communities, for instance? Do they recognize a relationship between the number of beavers building dams and then the amount of salmon that return because they're modifying the environment? That type of thing. And then, use that as a stepping stone to talk about other science concepts. That's not exactly the same thing at all, but I'm trying to figure out exactly what we're asking.
It's being, well, okay, so what I hear you saying is it's being thoughtful about what is already there and building into that. And I think evaluation planning, what is going to be meaningful in your evaluation? And is there something that you can build on that's already there
Yeah.
to make that evaluation more meaningful. And creation story, I don't know a lot about this topic either, but just storytelling in general, right? Maybe take it to a little more general level is, can your evaluation be told in some form of a story? It's just a case study, right? A case study is a story if you do it well. Is that a way that you want to portray your data? I'm certainly more interested when things are a story, and maybe the folks you work with, when that follow up, are going to be more interested in it as well. Does that make sense? Yeah, I'm still just figuring this out too, but it's thought. Tom, I feel like you have a thought. You have a
Yeah,
thought.
I don't know how to phrase it. So, yeah, what you're saying makes complete sense, especially if you realize that Indigenous stories are data summaries of their own based upon centuries of observation. So I think we can bring a certain perspective where it's a story, it's a narrative, that's all it is. Perhaps it makes meaning out of something that is important to a community living in this kind of environment, transitional pine, whatever, right? Elevation. But actually, they are themselves summaries of data based on observation. And I think they can definitely be included in evaluation for their power to illustrate those observations and the way that they have been codified sort of in narrative and are part of the understanding of things. I have a specific example. For a while, some of you guys know, I partnered with Tribal Health here in Minnesota on pairing PBIS and suicide prevention. And with Ojibwe communities, there's a story and understanding of a black snake that can enter your body and enter your being, and the snake coils, and that's why people feel like they're not themselves and they have this presence within them and stuff. And it's important to understand that concept. It's an active concept in the communities, so that your evaluation can work with that, as that's a foundational baseline understanding of mental health in communities. It's understood in those terms. Grandparents, great-grandparents have always thought about it that way. And I think it can help structure an evaluation in a way to build in those types of cultural understandings, which are actual everyday experiences of people, because it's an active cognition, and say something that in the end, in a good evaluation, can be validated by the community as, yes, you understood us, you asked the right questions, you collected your data in the right way, you drew the right conclusion, and the impact of your work will actually help us help ourselves or benefit us, the social impact. So I think, boy, I don't know where all that came from, but that's kind of the chain of thoughts when it comes to these Indigenous narratives and stuff like creation stories. Models of disease is easy because it's so important and it's so active out there. What does normal mental health look like? What does mental health disorder look like? What are the causes of disorder? What are and related to those causes, what are the things that treat mental health disorder or prevent suicide, things like that? I mean, we had a big adjustment here in Minnesota. And it did happen back when I was getting my school psych degree. I did my clinical internship at a university program, and they recognized the power of Indigenous belief in all medical treatments and healing processes, and hired the best available consultant from the tribes who understood both Ojibwe and Dakota to accompany people on these journeys of medical treatment and improve the outcomes of the clinic. So anyway, I think there's lots of good stories and evidence and research about that, especially in like the epidemiological and medical fields.
Yeah. And I think with evaluation, I remember I'd shared a couple of years ago South Dakota's evaluation plan, because it was such simple language that a family member could understand, etc. And I think that's a step, but this is kind of that next step of like, do you actually see yourself reflected in how you're being evaluated and what we're reporting on? does it mean anything to you? Does it matter to you? Yeah, mattering. Right, go back to the slideshow.
Tom, your explanation reminded me, and it's always, I hear her voice with every day with all of the work I do. And a former colleague in our Indian Ed department at the agency, and yes, she did voice it in anger and frustration, but there was 1,000% truth in it. And it was something to the effect of that she was frustrated, annoyed, angry, etc., that no one had bothered to longitudinally study their tribe and their tribe's effectiveness in educating their youth, like you're talking about Tom, in health issues for the tribe, and mark it down in white man's journals as evidence-based. And I hear her words to us that day with every step I take, and I try to honor her words, and with promising practices that these things have been effective for hundreds of years in these tribal nations. And she's right. Just because some modern white person didn't make it so doesn't mean it isn't so.
We could end on that note, but I have a few other slides, so I'm going to show. So doing science differently, co-management of resources, but here's the inclusion of Indigenous people in data analysis and decision-making, and other collaborative models where quantitative literacy and even fluency is required for participation. And of course, I think of the Minneapolis Department of Education, their district, how they supported those families to be in, families who had children being served under IDEA, and they supported them in learning about evaluation and carrying out an evaluation in partnership, right? MDE, Minneapolis Department of Education, was helping them throughout, so they had support, but it was their evaluation. They were making the decisions, etc. I think we're pretty far from there right now. You know, it takes some significant steps, but this idea that it's not throwing out the quantitative aspects of it, but again, making it meaningful and ensuring that folks understand what, why, how, and can collaborate. So this is about including different voices. And this group has been great about thinking about student voice. And I'm interested in what approaches, methods have worked well in including different voices than historically were included in evaluation. I love even the idea, like I talk about student, but even, you know, before that, where we considered children, you can include children in evaluation too, right? You give them visual images and they're able to draw on it, or they're able to point to something, they're able to verbalize something. So, you know, I tend to think of middle school and high school students when I'm talking about including student voice in the evaluation, but really it can start much earlier than that.
Jennifer, when I was a special ed teacher, we were able to work with our technology department. So prior to the annual IEP meeting, when we were sharing out progress, the students would do a video clip and they would share things, and they could pick wherever they wanted to do it in the school. So some, you know, picked the gym, you know, some picked the art room, but they were able to share what they thought was going well prior to their parents, you know, hearing it from the adults. They were the first voice brought into the room.
And they love that, right?
Like, they did. Yeah,
Yeah.
and then the parents, wanted to get the clip of the video clip, to share with grandparents, relatives, because it showed them in a different spotlight than how they're often seen. It showed them in their glory, in their strengths.
That's great. Good.
I also think that voice, like Becky said, I was elementary too. The video clips in Genius, we just wrote in their notes. It would have been so much more fun that way. Um, but I mean, I worked with kindergartners who had the best input on what their goals should be, what they needed.
Mhm.
The best ideas for behavior plan supports come from those kids themselves. Like, I mean, and then you reach the goals faster when it's their want and heart. And I think that's true for all of us, right?
Mhm. I'm just taking notes.
One thing that's been helpful too is asking the students where they feel comfortable. So like when we've done student focus groups, some students do not feel comfortable if it's in a group of 2 to 3. They'll
Mm.
share if it's just individually. And so really thinking too, about what type of group they feel comfortable in. And some students have felt comfortable like getting the questions ahead of time. Some have brought in the questions but have drawings next to it. So letting them doodle, draw, whatever ways are possible for them to communicate, but it can look differently.
Mhm. Great.
I don't have any brilliant ideas about how to do this, but as we've talked about all of the most recent subject areas in your slide presentation, one thing that I
Mhm.
just keep thinking about when it comes to evaluation and testing and, results and all that is the importance of helping families, communities, and students understand the why behind all of that. How is this even relevant in your life? Why do we even care about these test results? Why do we even care if you know how to do this? I'm going through this with my kids. I have been for decades now. As some of my kids are, it feels like it happens a lot more in math than in other things. But why? Why do we have to do this? Why do we have to do
Right.
this? If there was some way, and I think it would be culture to culture and community to community, if you could explain how some of these things are relevant, then the evaluation would be more meaningful. And I also think that you would get, for lack of a better word, more effort, more engagement in, the actual testing and things themselves. If they understand how will this tie back in, I want to be a farmer, I want to work the land. Okay, how will this math tie back in to helping with that?
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm thinking of one study in particular where teachers don't know why different things, it's like you ask them and you're like, well, why did you do this assessment? It's like, I don't know. I just do it, so there's yeah, lots of levels of understanding the why.
And some assessments are like that. Like some assessments are, I'm sorry, but some assessments are
Yeah.
just silly. And if the teacher and the district don't even understand why they're relevant, it's hard to explain it to the kids. So, but even if we could just
Absolutely.
tease out certain concepts, and again, going back to this culturally relevant thing, whatever that is for our Native American culture, but even in like, I mentioned farming before, like our small farming communities that we have in Montana here. How can you tie that stuff back into how will you use this in your life if you want to stay around here and be a farmer? I
Right.
think that is helpful in the evaluation story because it's the whole point. How will you use these skills and this knowledge later on to be a better person and have a better life and be more fulfilled? I mean, anyway, don't want to wax too
Yeah.
philosophical, but that has been the thought in my head this whole time.
Yeah. No, I don't think it's philosophical. I think that is very practical. I think I'm trying to think of the most important things. Yeah, so unique considerations. I think just we could come back to this next week, or you could just be thinking about it. But definitions and designations, like what do you mean by certain things? I think this goes along with what you're just saying, Jenny. It's like describe it, like what's important. Can you give an example of it, etc. So everyone's on the same page when it comes to evaluation. Data collection is big. This is not just Native communities, but goes to that, why are you collecting the data? What are you going to do with it? Why is it important? And people talk about how fidelity is the new F word sometimes, but that would only be because people don't understand how important it is to connect it with the impact, right? Data sharing, we talked about that follow-up, how important that is. And then asking different questions of the same data. I think this relates to that exploratory data analysis too. It's like you got some data, but are you asking all the possible questions of the data, or is your bias keeping you from doing that? And reading about different kinds of indigenous methods can help you to be asking questions a little bit differently. I think you got to see those examples to think about it. And then to Annette's point in the chat, this idea from Saffer and Dugan of big data, little data, and micro data. They call it different things, right? But satellite map and street. But our presenter last director's webinar, Rebecca Hornak, talked about big data, little data, and micro data, and thinking through where you need what kind of data. And is it thinking through the context that the kids you're working with, and this is what it does for you. So what do you all want to follow up on next time? Anything that we talked about that you would hope we would get into in more depth? Or do you feel pretty good about communication, evaluation, and we're ready for initial implementation?
I have new thoughts about fidelity, but I'm gonna hold my cards when we get to like a place to talk about that. But yeah, I don't know. Could just be a Tom
Are
thing.
you talking about fidelity and adaptation? Did you want to have that conversation?
Yeah, or fidelity of implementation. I mean, in our work, quantitatively thinking, we worry about fidelity to measure whether the practice is being implemented the way research or other evidence has demonstrated it's effective. But then I've been thinking about, is there still a presumption that the circumstances of implementation are comparable to the research circumstances on which the fidelity score is implemented? And at that point, I start getting into a tribal school or working with specific populations like American Indian students with disabilities, and just naturally there is what do you want to call it, heterogeneity in the schools themselves. They're so vastly different. So I'm wondering, this morning I was sitting around this morning, it's like, well, at best fidelity is part of the picture and it's important, so we pay attention to it. But should I be holding a space open for fidelity really presumes that where the practice was established and researched is so comparable or practically comparable to my work circumstances? And I don't know that that's true. I know that would get into representation and research and stuff, but we hammer fidelity really hard at MDE, and it's like, God, is that, and I can live with that if it's important, but at the same time, do you have to keep in mind that where the research was done to establish the core components of the practice and the fidelity score is not the same as where I'm trying to do it.
Right.
I don't know where that goes, but it's just
I think it'd be a great conversation. Is everyone up for that conversation? Fidelity, adaptation, etc.
Yep.
All right. Okay, thank you.
Easy.
Affirmation is my love language. So sometimes, I know I'm just out there. I'm like, man, no one else is thinking like this.
We've been trying to figure this out for 20 years. So I think we can do it at the next meeting for sure.
All right. Good.
All right. Good to see you guys. And stay warm. I hope. And Annette, send us that picture of you rowing.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, bye, guys. Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
okay, bye-bye.